I never thought one evening could unravel something I hadn't even realized was knotted inside me. It was late spring when it happened. The kind of evening when the windows are open, just enough to let in the scent of fresh grass and distant conversation. The days were longer, but I still found myself wrapped in layers, not because of the weather, but because I often felt cold in ways sweaters couldn't fix. At 64, I had accepted certain things about life. That comfort replaced excitement. That silence filled more space than music once did. And that, sometimes, being needed wasn't the same as being seen. My husband, Tom, had been friends with Gerald since their college years. They were part of each other's stories long before I entered the picture. Gerald had never married, though he spoke often of women he'd loved and lost. He was the kind of man who lingered too long in doorways, whose compliments felt like smoke you couldn't catch. Tom invited him to stay the weekend. "He's going through something," Tom said. "It might do him good to be around a calm home for a bit." A calm home. I wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or a diagnosis. I prepared the guest room the way I always did. Fresh linens, a small vase of garden flowers, an extra quilt folded at the foot of the bed. I baked a pear tart, something I rarely made anymore. Not for Gerald, just for the memory of enjoying it myself. Gerald arrived on a Friday afternoon, carrying an old duffel and that easy charm he wore like a second skin. He hugged Tom tightly and gave me a kiss on the cheek that lingered a breath too long. "Still the loveliest woman on the block," he said. I smiled politely, retreating behind the safety of the kitchen. Dinner was easy. Conversation flowed between the two men with practiced rhythm. Sports, news, mutual acquaintances. I chimed in where I could, mostly to refill glasses and pass the bread. It wasn't until later, after Tom had gone to bed with a headache, that things changed. Gerald and I remained in the living room. The lights dimmed, a soft record playing. One of Tom's jazz favorites. I sat curled in my chair with a book in my lap I wasn't reading. Gerald poured himself another drink and leaned against the fireplace mantel, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You always were wasted on him, you know?" he said suddenly, his voice low. I blinked. "Excuse me?" He took a sip of his scotch and smiled, not cruelly, just knowingly. "Tom's a good man, but he doesn't see you. Not the way you deserve." There was a silence then. Not awkward, not charged, just heavy. Like a truth had been placed on the table, and we were both deciding whether to look at it. "You're tired of being invisible," he added. "I can tell." I set the book down. There was something dangerous about the moment, not in the way movies portray, with sudden closeness or reckless declarations. It was quieter than that. A suggestion. An opening. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood up, told him good night, and walked away. But the words stayed with me, like smoke clinging to the fabric of an old coat. That night, I lay awake beside my sleeping husband, the weight of Gerald's observation pressing into the quiet. Was I invisible? And if so, when had I stopped trying to be seen? The next morning arrived like any other, except that it didn't. I moved through the kitchen as if my hands belonged to someone else. Cracked eggs into a bowl, measured coffee grounds. I avoided Gerald's eyes when he entered, barefoot and humming, like he belonged there. Tom joined us shortly after, rubbing his temples and asking for aspirin before he asked how anyone had slept. "Like a rock," Gerald answered. I didn't answer at all. But all day, I could feel it. Not just the words he'd said the night before, but the way he'd said them. Calm. As though he hadn't overstepped, but merely uncovered something I hadn't wanted to look at. That evening, Tom suggested a drive to the lake. He and Gerald had spent summers there in their youth. I packed sandwiches, thermoses of tea, and a tin of ginger cookies. I didn't ask to join. Tom invited me with a gentle hand on my shoulder. The lake was quiet, the parking lot nearly empty. We sat on a bench overlooking the water. Gerald was telling a story I'd heard before. Something about a fishing trip gone wrong and the girl he'd met that same weekend. But I wasn't really listening. Instead, I watched the way Tom laughed, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he was truly at ease. I remembered that look from years ago, but I hadn't seen it in a while. He turned to me then, mid-laugh, and said, "Remember that trip we took after the kids moved out to Maine?" I nodded. "You were so happy by the ocean. You said you felt like you could breathe differently there." He smiled. I blinked, surprised by the memory, surprised he'd remembered it. Gerald watched us in silence. Later on the drive home, I sat in the back seat. Tom and Gerald talked up front, like old friends do, effortlessly, freely. I stared out the window, the trees slipping past like thoughts I couldn't quite hold. When we got home, Tom went upstairs to take a call from one of the kids. Gerald lingered behind in the hallway. "You and Tom," he said, leaning lightly against the wall. "There's love there. But is it enough?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because the question wasn't his to ask. That night, I stood at the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair slowly, methodically. I looked at my reflection, waiting to see what would stare back. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look away. Gerald left the next morning. He didn't make a show of it. No long goodbye, no dramatic pause, just a suitcase zipped, a hand briefly resting on my shoulder, and a quiet, "Take care, Nora." I nodded. "You too." And just like that, he was gone. The door closed behind him, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Tom returned to his usual pace. Early mornings, long phone calls, the evening news humming in the background. But something had shifted in me, something I couldn't unfeel. I found myself folding laundry more slowly, listening to the kettle whistle a moment longer before turning off the stove. I walked the neighborhood loop each day, a little farther each time, not to get anywhere, just to move. One afternoon, I sat in the small room we used to call the study, though no one had studied anything in it for years. I opened the bottom drawer of the old desk and found a forgotten notebook. The first few pages held grocery lists, phone numbers, a recipe for banana bread. The rest was blank. So I wrote, nothing grand, just a few lines. Sometimes the hardest part isn't being lonely. It's realizing how long you've been pretending not to be. The words stared back at me. Honest in a way I hadn't dared to be aloud. That evening, Tom asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I said yes. We sat on the couch like we used to, sharing a blanket, our hands not quite touching. It was a simple film, soft music, and long silences. At one point, he turned to me and said, "You've seemed quiet lately." I didn't deny it. I didn't explain. Instead, I said, "Do you remember when we used to talk before bed? Just talk?" He looked surprised. Not defensive, just surprised. "I do," he said. "I miss that too." We didn't say much more that night, but something about that short exchange settled inside me. Not like an answer, but like the beginning of a question I might finally have the courage to ask. Not about Gerald, about us, about me, about who I was before the years folded over me, so gently I didn't notice until I was tucked too tightly inside them. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to loosen the edges and breathe again. I began to notice small things after Gerald left. How often Tom and I sat in the same room without speaking. How I sometimes answered his questions before he asked them, out of habit. How we moved around each other with the ease of routine, but not the intimacy of connection. We were comfortable, but comfort, I was beginning to realize, wasn't the same as closeness. That weekend, I went to the bookstore downtown. I hadn't done that in years. I used to go once a month. Back when I was teaching part-time and still filling notebooks with ideas and reflections. I wandered the aisles slowly, letting my fingers trace the spines of novels I hadn't read and poetry I used to love. I bought a small volume of essays about aging and solitude. The title caught me. Stillness as a Form of Motion. Back home, I curled up in the armchair and read the first few pages. One line stopped me. We don't lose ourselves all at once. We disappear in whispers. I sat with that sentence for a long time. That evening, as Tom sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through emails on his tablet, I placed a mug of tea beside him. "Thanks," he murmured, barely looking up. I sat across from him, wrapping my hands around my own cup, searching his face. "Do you ever think we've stopped asking about each other?" I asked quietly. He looked up then, really looked. And for a moment, I saw the man I married, the one who used to write little notes and leave them tucked in my coat pocket. The man who once painted the bedroom yellow because I said I missed the sun. "Maybe we have," he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a solution. But it was honest. We sat in silence again, but this time it felt different. Not avoidance, acknowledgement. A shared moment of realizing we'd let something slip without meaning to. Later that night, I found myself reaching for my journal again. I am not angry, just awake, and it's lonelier than I expected. But even in that loneliness, there was a strange kind of hope, because waking up, even gently, still meant there was something to wake up to. And maybe that was the beginning of something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The days unfolded gently. I didn't make dramatic changes. No sweeping declarations. No sudden confrontations. Instead, I allowed myself quiet shifts. I left the dishes until morning once or twice. I took longer walks, even in the rain. I let myself listen to music in the kitchen, without rushing to fold towels or sort through the mail. Tom noticed in his way. He began asking if I wanted to join him for errands, offering to make tea before I could stand to do it myself. We weren't suddenly different, but there was a tenderness returning, like old roots finding their way back to water. One afternoon, I returned from a walk and found a small envelope tucked into the slat of our front door. My name was written across the front in a hand I didn't recognize. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a single sentence. "It's never too late to ask yourself who you are becoming." No signature, no explanation. I looked around, half expecting someone to be standing at the corner of the street, watching. But no one was there. The air smelled of lilacs and wet pavement. I sat on the porch for a long while, that paper resting lightly in my lap. I didn't tell Tom. Not because I was keeping a secret, but because I didn't know how to explain that a stranger's words could feel like something I'd been waiting to hear. That evening, as we cleared the dinner plates, I asked Tom, "Do you think we're still growing?" He paused, setting a dish in the sink. "I think we stopped noticing," he said, "and maybe that's the same thing." I dried my hands and turned to him. "I want to notice again." He nodded, and for a moment, neither of us moved. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even clarity, but it was mutual. Later, in bed, I lay awake listening to his breathing. My thoughts wandered back to Gerald, not with longing, but with recognition. He had unsettled something, yes, but he had also stirred an awareness I could no longer ignore. Not about him, about me. I wasn't looking for something new. I was remembering something true. And maybe that kind of remembering, quiet, steady, rooted in ordinary days, was the most powerful kind of change. I began visiting the library again. It had always been a quiet refuge for me. Rows of worn spines, soft chairs in sunlit corners. The smell of old pages and settled dust. I hadn't realized how much I missed it until I stepped inside one afternoon and felt something settle in me like a sigh. I didn't look for anything specific. I let my fingers drift across the shelves until they landed on a slim book about solitude. The title made me smile, The Quiet Kind of Brave. At home, I started reading it in the evenings, just a few pages at a time. The words didn't shout, they didn't try to convince. They simply offered themselves. I found a passage that made me pause. Sometimes growth doesn't look like reaching forward. Sometimes it looks like standing still and letting yourself be found. I reread that sentence 3 times. That night, I didn't bring it up to Tom. Instead, I made soup from scratch, lit a candle on the table, and turned off the television during dinner. We ate in a kind of worn silence, the kind that says everything isn't fixed, but something is being tended to. Afterward, he brought our mugs of tea into the living room and sat beside me on the couch. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how long it's been since we asked each other real questions." I looked at him. He smiled faintly. "Do you still like who you're becoming?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to, because the fact that he had asked, the fact that he'd thought to ask, meant something was changing. Later, as I wrote in my journal, I found myself smiling. Not because everything was different, but because the distance between who I was and who I wanted to be suddenly felt a little smaller. Gerald's words had shaken something loose, but they hadn't defined what followed. What followed was mine. Not a dramatic unraveling, just the slow and steady act of returning to myself. And maybe, just maybe, of being met there. Spring arrived, tentative and slow. I opened the windows more often, let the air move through the rooms. I started setting a small vase of flowers on the kitchen table again. Not for anyone else, just because I liked the way the color greeted me in the morning. Life didn't feel louder, but it felt more mine. Tom and I fell into a gentler rhythm. We didn't talk about everything that had gone unspoken for years, but we didn't avoid it either. Some nights, we watched the news in silence. Other nights, we walked around the block and spoke of small things. Weather, neighbors, the price of groceries. And sometimes, in the quiet, our hands would find each other. One Saturday, I sat alone on the back steps with a cup of coffee. The sun was warm against my knees. I thought of Gerald, not with ache, not with regret, just as a part of the path that had brought me back to myself. He had seen something in me I had long stopped seeing, but now I was learning to see it without him, to believe in my own visibility. Later that week, I found the slip of paper I'd tucked into the back of my journal, the one with the question, "Do you still like who you're becoming?" I read it again, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the answer rise without hesitation. Yes, not because everything was perfect, not because anything had resolved like a story in a book, but because I was living in the questions now, walking slowly, listening more, letting the stillness count. I hadn't told anyone the full story of that night with Gerald. I didn't need to. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about waking up in my own life, about realizing that attention is a kind of love. and that the person who most needed to offer it to me was me. I finished my coffee, went inside, and started the day without rush, without apology, just with presence. And that, I decided, was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write to the bell, and share your impressions of listening to this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.